Right. So address allocation for IP version 6. So for IP version 4, we had manual allocation and then we had DHCP. And now for IP version 6, you can do manual or you can use SLAAC. SLAAC says basically we're just configuring a prefix on that interface. So we're giving the default gateway an address, and let's just see if we can hover over there. You can see the gateway has an address in the range AAAA, and it has a prefix of 64. Okay, so we basically configure that over there, and what then will happen is these devices will be able to automatically, using EUI64, generate IP addresses for themselves using the same prefix and the same prefix length. Okay. Secondly, you get stateless DHCP. Now with stateless DHCP, the addressing will happen the same way, but the devices will receive things like the DNS server information from a DHCP pool that has been configured here. It will not receive address information though. And then lastly, we get stateful DHCP version 6, which is similar to what we have in DHCP version 4. In other words, everything comes from the DHCP server. It gets things like the DNS settings, the default gateway, and it also gets, say for instance, the actual IP address. So the server will keep track of the allocations of IP addresses. Okay, so fantastic. Now what we want to do over here is we are just going to go, and oh yes, by the way, what I've also defined on this device, I've also changed the link local address. Remember, for IP version 6, the devices also have link local addresses, and you can set that. Let me just show you. So let's check it out. Okay, as you can see over there, I've changed it. I've defined the normal prefix and everything on here. And then I've also defined and said, listen, we have a link local address of FE81 and the address is link local. So this makes it that this is the link local address for this device. If we don't do it, it would just use something like EUI to generate its own link local address. This is just to give you a little bit more consistency in your network. Okay, so what we can do is, we've seen that the prefix over here is AAA and the prefix length is 64. So if we go to a PC over here and I say ipconfig, and you'll see it's already been set to automatic, and automatic generates an IP version 6 address of AAAA, and then the rest it just generates via EUI, and the prefix length is 64, and you'll see the default gateway is that link local address I set up. Okay, and then let's see this one. Okay, same thing, prefix of AAAA, prefix length of 64. This is generated via EUI. You can see it's the same as the link local address basically, except for the prefix. And then as a default gateway, it uses this one over here, which is the link local address of our actual router interface. Okay, and that's all there is to configuring SLAAC. So let's go and update this now, and let's go and configure DHCP. So what we want to do, we're going to go into global config mode, and then we want to say IPv6, and then what we want to configure is DHCP, and we want to configure pool, and let's give it a name, my pool. Okay, fantastic. So that's our first step. So the next thing we want to do, let's see what Packet Tracer allows us to do. We don't want to do address. We want to do something like, say for instance, we are doing DNS server. Okay, so let's say DNS server, and we'll say that the DNS server is AAAA1. Okay, That's all we want to configure. So the next thing we're going to do is we now need to go into interface gig 00. Okay, so let's see, what do we have? Let's start with IPv6, and then our options, DHCP. Okay, so we have options for client and we have options for server. Okay, so we want to go with IPv6, DHCP server, and then it asks us for the name of the DHCP pool to work with. Okay, so what did we call our pool? I think we called it my pool. So let's say my pool. Okay, so at the moment it's not actually doing anything yet. It's just saying, listen, should you want to do something, use my pool. Okay, fantastic. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to say IPv6, and then there's a little thing there that says ND. Okay, which stands for neighbor discovery subcommands. So neighbor discovery, and then we have the ones that we care about is managed config flag and other config flag. So we want to say other config flag. So what this does, when you issue this command, it sets the other config flag to a value of 1. So if the other config flag has a value of 1, it means we are now doing stateless DHCP version 6. So in other words, it's going to take certain things from the DHCP pool, excluding the address. The address will still go via SLAAC. Okay, and that is it. That should be our setup. So let's go back to one of the PCs. Okay, and there we can go. You can see it's already, after we've done this, it's already done a new request. And you can see our DNS server is now set to what we configured. So our DNS server is set to AAAA and 1. Okay. So our last step is now to go and change this so that it becomes stateful DHCP. Okay. So the last step to do that is we're going to go back and revisit our DHCP pool. So IP version 6 DHCP pool, my pool, and then let's do the question mark again. Just for interest's sake, we could also define a domain name. We could have done that with stateless as well. Let's say mydomain.com. But what we do want to configure is we want to configure the address, and then let's do the question mark first. We want to do address prefix. Okay, so what that's going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to configure the prefix. In other words, for all intents and purposes, the network portion that all addresses from this pool should have, along with the prefix length. So we're saying all addresses from this pool are going to have the prefix AAAA, and then we are going to assign the prefix length of 64. Okay, that's it. That's the only updates we need to our pool. Now that hasn't switched it over yet. We can actually test it. Okay, as you can see, it's still doing like the SLAAC thing, where it uses the prefix from the interface and then uses EUI. So we still need to switch it over so that it does full DHCP version 6. So let's go to gig 00 and then IPv6. Again, we want to go ND. And in this case, we want to set the managed config flag. Okay, so once we set the managed config flag like this, it sets the value of the flag to 1. Now in this case, it doesn't actually matter what the value of the other config flag is. Even though this other config flag is set to 1, it makes no difference. As soon as this one is set to the value of 1, in other words, as soon as you issue this command, regardless of whether this thing is still active, it automatically switches you to stateful mode. So you don't have to first say no. Let me just type it out. You don't have to first issue the command no IPv6 other config flag. Okay, there's no need for it. You can do it if you want, but it's not necessary. We can simply say IPv6 nd managed config flag. And that just switched us over to stateful DHCP. Okay, so now let's go back over to the PC and let's force it again. Okay, so what I need you to notice is take a look at the IP address that it has. Okay, I want to see if the other one still has its old one. Nah, it's also updated. Take a look at this. You remember with SLAAC, the IP address that was allocated was basically this portion would have been the same over there, because with SLAAC, the same as with this one for the link local, it would have generated this portion over here. It would have generated it via EUI64. But now it's not doing that. It's basically getting something that's not the same as this anymore. So it's basically getting this part from the DHCP pool. So that's why you'll see it no longer matches.